On July 20th, 1969, a man set foot on the moon for the very first time. It was the culmination of years of work. It was one of the most celebrated events of the 20th century. And while it was the first successful attempt to land a man on the moon, it was hardly the first one that American groups came up with when they set their sights on going to the moon. Following the Second World War, there were numerous groups and agencies in the United States that realized that space was the next frontier, and they put out several plans on how to conquer that frontier. Those plans proliferated even more after the launching of Sputnik in 1957. Some of them were quite promising, others not so much. The forgotten moon plans are history that deserve to be remembered.
Humans have long been curious about reaching the moon. A work by Lucian of Samosata from 125 AD might be the first work of fiction to imagine what it might be like. It was the center of many stories of early science fiction, like the 1638 story The Man in the Moon, or 1657's Comical History of the States and Empires of the Moon by Cyrano de Bergerac. These and other novels were the antecedents to books like Jules Verne's 1865 From Earth to the Moon and H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon, which inspired Georges Méliès's film A Trip to the Moon in 1902. Serious consideration of landing on the moon wouldn't come until later in the century, when scientists began to understand the true extent of the challenges behind such an expedition. Perhaps the most famous declaration for reaching the moon is President John F. Kennedy's speech to Congress in May 1961, when he said that I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. But that wasn't the first public announcement of plans to have astronauts reach the moon. 3 years earlier, and only months after the Soviets had successfully launched Sputnik, General Homer Bauchy announced that the Air Force was preparing plans to build a lunar base. In a speech to the Aero Club, the general said, "He who controls the moon controls the Earth. If true, and I for one think it is, then the U.S. must control the moon." Bauchy's announcement was actually part of an interbranch battle going back years between the Army, Navy, and the Air Force over who should have control of the strategic missile arsenal, as well as the nation's space program. The United States Air Force itself was a new branch when the Army Air Forces became their own branch in 1947. Even before it became a branch, the Army Air Force had begun examining the potentials of space. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, wrote in November 1945 that a spaceship is all but practicable today and could be built within the foreseeable future. He tasked General Bernard Schriever with working with scientists to advance technologies that would be necessary to that end. The Navy, too, was interested and produced a satellite report in 1945 and proposed an inter-service space program in March 1946. But the Air Force saw space as its purview alone. They turned to Douglas Aircraft and Project RAND, which produced a preliminary design of an experimental world-circling spaceship in May 1946. A satellite, it said, offers an observation aircraft which cannot be brought down by the enemy. It formed the foundation of Air Force satellite efforts in the years that followed. While the Air Force did develop critical satellite technology, everything changed in 1957, when the Soviets beat the United States to actually launching one. Sputnik had a dramatic effect on American space policy. President Eisenhower created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, in February 1958, which was tasked with deciding how the space program should move forward. At the same time, the civilian space program, NASA, was created out of the earlier National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA. By the end of February, ARPA had made a quick and decisive choice in who should lead the military space program: the Air Force. This was despite the Army actually launching America's first satellite, Explorer 1, and the Navy's Vanguard project. General Bernard Schriever directed the development of the plan, and the first draft was overseen by Colonel Harry Lee Evans, with a team of more than 60 people, who put together a proposal and delivered it on April 25, 1958. The plan had several phases. First, Man in Space Soonest, or MISS, a program meant to get a man in space before the Soviet Union. The plan was to use a one-person capsule and launch it into space using a Thor missile. 6 missions would be flown unmanned, followed by 6 missions using animals. It would be followed by Man in Space Sophisticated, a 3-phase, 28-flight program. The first 2 phases would use either Thor fluorine boosters or Super Titan fluorine rockets, but the final stage planned on using a space plane already in development, the Boeing X-20 Dinosaur. The first phase involved unmanned and test animal missions in a capsule that could survive in space for 2 weeks. The second stage involved sending a spacecraft 40,000 miles, as well as testing re-entry. The Dinosaur would also be used in Lunar Reconnaissance Phase, or LUREC, meant to orbit the moon. LUREC also involved the testing of guidance systems, capturing TB images to select potential landing sites, and tracking and communications. LUREC 3 was planned to actually land on the moon. The final stage of the program, dubbed Manned Lunar Landing and Return, or Project Lumen, was scheduled for May of 1962. It also involved a series of flights beginning with animals to test hardware, while Lumen 2 would carry astronauts in a circumlunar flight. Lumen 5, planned for 1965, involved a lander derived from the original MISS design that could land and return from the moon with astronauts. Launching it would be accomplished by a proposed rocket with 2 million pounds of thrust, dubbed Big B. Shortly after they delivered the report, Colonel Evans was told it was too ambitious and to remove any references to lunar missions. The lack of a military angle, combined with recent decisions to create NASA, made the Air Force plan redundant. Despite that, on June 25, 1958, the Air Force announced a list of men who had been selected as candidates for the MISS mission, which included Neil Armstrong, as well as Robert N. White and Joseph A. Walker, both of whom would reach space as test pilots for the X-15 aircraft. NASA's creation and later the development of Project Mercury led to the cancellation of the program on August 1, 1958, and the cancellation of the Dinosaur project a few years later. Project Mercury was publicly announced on December 17, 1958. The same month, aerospace contractor company Chance Vought Aeronautics Division began studying concepts for vehicles that could follow Mercury. Soon, possible lunar missions became the focus, and Conrad Lau was put in charge of Project Malar, or Manned Lunar Landing and Return. Lau was the co-designer of the F-8U Crusader. By the end of December 1959, Lau was prepared to show his plans to a congressional delegation. Malar planned to use module components and utilize rendezvous and docking techniques to accomplish his mission. A 2- or 3-person entry vehicle was designed that could be attached to a payload module that could act as temporary space station for Earth orbital missions. For a proposed moon landing, the plan involved a 2-person entry vehicle, a lunar mission module, a lunar landing module, and a rocket stage. The whole system would be assembled in Earth orbit. Astronauts would orbit the moon, transfer to the lunar landing module, and then after a 24-hour stay launch back from the moon to rendezvous with other still orbiting modules. The lunar orbit rendezvous technique was likely the most important part of the plan, as it saved 50% of the total mission weight compared to sending a craft directly to the moon. Ultimately, the Malar concept failed to get any support from NASA, and Vought failed to secure NASA contracts for the later Apollo missions. Within NASA, however, engineer John Houbolt did successfully lobby to use the rendezvous technique for Apollo. On February 15, 1960, Abe Silverstein, heading NASA's space efforts, ordered the program to essentially follow the Malar template, if not strictly Vought's system. ARPA's decision to cut out the U.S. Army from the space program was not happily accepted. The Army had an ace, Wernher von Braun and his team of rocket scientists. After the creation of NASA, von Braun's team was offered leftover ARPA funds, and in 1958 they designed a 1.5 million pound launch system dubbed Juno 5. With NASA getting up and running, von Braun's team again found itself without funding. In December 1958, the team met with NASA to present their ideas. One of the team's engineers, Frank Williams, had the audacious idea that constructing a moon base would satisfy the military angle for the construction of the Juno rocket. Williams pitched the idea to the Army chiefs, who in turn asked for the idea to get a proper plan treatment. Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau argued that a lunar outpost is of critical importance to the U.S. Army of the future. The Army was afraid of playing second fiddle to the Soviets again, arguing that to be second to the Soviet Union in establishing an outpost on the moon would be disastrous to our nation's prestige, and in turn, to our democratic philosophy. The military believed that the goal of a base would be to use it as a platform for weapon systems. It asked for a Manhattan Project level of priority. Within 90 days, the team had produced 4 volumes on what they called Project Horizon. Horizon was an ambitious project involving the construction of a military base on the moon at the cost of around $6 billion. The base would permanently host 12 men, be powered by nuclear reactors, and get regular deliveries from Earth. The logistics were considerably more complicated. The base would largely be made of titanium cylinder buried beneath the moon's surface, which provided protection from temperature fluctuations, meteorite bombardment, and radiation. The need for reliable communication, deliveries, and moon infrastructure were enormous. Von Braun was a proponent of Earth orbit rendezvous, where rockets would assemble a lunar rocket stage in orbit that would then meet with a crewed spacecraft on its way to the moon. Von Braun thought it impractical to construct a rocket that could make a direct moon landing. As early as 1952, von Braun had proposed a plan to use the technique to assemble a nearly 4,000-ton spacecraft that could take 50 astronauts to the moon as well as an orbital space station. Horizon, by comparison, was modest. It argued that some supplies could be directly launched to the moon, but crewed missions would utilize a space station. The project envisioned 40 rockets launched throughout 1964 to prepare for a manned moon landing in 1965. Then came the difficult part of constructing the base, which would involve the launch of almost 150 Saturn rockets. Horizon hoped that by November 1966, the base would be ready for permanent occupation. By the end of 1967, the team predicted that 42 astronauts would have been to the moon. The base would have living quarters, a laboratory, medical and communication facilities, and storage room, all of metal cylinders assembled in an L shape. Lunar construction vehicles were envisioned, and the base would be protected by claymore mines and nuclear-tipped rockets. The whole proposal was likely wildly optimistic in its time frame and budget estimates, but any possibility of actually being built faded when von Braun and his team transferred from the Army to NASA. Even after NASA had taken over as the primary agency in charge of space, the Air Force wasn't ready to entirely forsake the idea of heading a project to reach the moon. 4 days after President Kennedy gave his speech advocating for a moon landing before the end of the decade, the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division delivered plans for a moon expedition under Project LUNEX. LUNEX relied on the Dinosaur and planning from their earlier proposal. Unlike Horizon and Malar, LUNEX proposed a direct ascent to the moon using a 6 million-pound thrust cryogenic launcher. 3 crew would ride a lifting body, which would both land on the moon and return to Earth. It scheduled a manned moon landing late in the decade, and by 1968, the establishment of a 21-person moon base.
In the end, all of these programs were abandoned. They were either canceled or ignored. Dinosaur was canceled in 1963, and essentially all the money and the support of the public interest went into the Apollo program and NASA. The idea of putting a military base on the moon seemingly ended in 1967 with the signing of the Outer Space Treaty between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, which expressly forbids the building of military bases or testing of weapons on the moon. And while none of these programs quite came to fruition, they did say a lot about the times, about our optimism in the technology, about our fear of the Soviet Union and that ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, about the belief that space would be the next frontier. Some of the technologies envisioned also contributed to the development of rocket technologies, and so, in a way, saw their culmination in the Apollo program and Neil Armstrong's small step. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.